Hello, my sleepy friends. Imagine the night has already settled across a medieval town long before what we would call bedtime. There are no glowing windows from electricity, no distant hum of traffic, no late-night activity continuing into the early hours. Instead, darkness arrives almost as a physical presence. Once the sun disappears, the world truly changes. Doors close earlier than you expect, shutters are fastened, and wooden beams creak as families retreat indoors. Outside, the streets do not feel empty, but watchful, as if the town itself is resting. Most history speaks of kings, battles, castles, and crowns, yet ordinary life in the Middle Ages was filled with quiet realities people rarely wrote down because they seemed too normal to mention. One of these was the experience of darkness itself. Night was not simply the end of the day. It divided life into two different worlds. Day belonged to work, trade, and community, but night belonged to uncertainty. Without street lighting, a person stepping outside after dusk moved through near total blackness, guided only by memory of familiar paths and faint starlight overhead. Even the moon, when present, became a kind of companion. Because of this, sleep did not happen the way it does today. Many people did not sleep straight through the night. Instead, they practiced what historians now call segmented sleep, though medieval people would never have named it so. Families rested for several hours after nightfall, then woke quietly around midnight. For a short time, homes became gently active again. Someone added wood to the fire, another whispered a conversation, a mother checked a child, or a person simply sat awake in stillness. This waking period felt natural to them, not strange. Afterwards, they returned to sleep until dawn. The night, therefore, contained its own rhythm, almost like a second smaller day hidden inside the darkness. Another rarely discussed part of medieval life was how sound carried at night. During the day, towns were loud with carts, animals, tools, and voices, but once darkness arrived, even the smallest noise traveled far. A distant footstep could be heard across a street. A door closing echoed. A cough from one house might be noticed by a neighbor. Privacy, especially in tightly built towns, barely existed. People learned to live with constant awareness of others. Relationships were shaped by this closeness. Behavior could not easily be hidden, and reputation depended not only on actions, but on how quietly one moved through shared space. Night watchmen walked slowly along roads, not as soldiers, but as observers. Their role was less about confrontation and more about reassurance. Hearing a steady voice calling the hour reminded residents that someone remained awake while they slept. The watchman's lantern glow moving along the street became a familiar comfort, a small circle of light traveling through darkness. It was not unusual for someone unable to sleep to listen for those footsteps and feel calmer simply knowing another human presence existed nearby. Medieval evenings also revealed something else rarely described: the pace of thought. Without artificial light, activity slowed. Reading was rare after sunset because candles were expensive and dim. Instead, people sat near a hearth, speaking quietly or simply listening to the fire. In these moments, conversation became deeper. Stories passed between generations not as entertainment but as memory. Knowledge traveled through voice rather than text, and a child often learned family history not from books but from repeated spoken tales heard many times over years. Illness at night carried a different emotional weight as well. If someone became sick after dark, Help was not easily reached. Roads were unsafe, and distance felt greater without daylight. Families cared for one another directly. This closeness strengthened bonds but also created acceptance. People understood life was uncertain. That understanding shaped behavior. Arguments were often resolved before sleep because no one wanted the last word spoken to remain harsh if morning did not come. Even small details of the environment influenced daily feeling. The smell of smoke lingered constantly inside homes because hearth fires burned almost all year. Clothing absorbed that scent. Hair carried it. To medieval people, this smell did not signal discomfort but safety. The absence of smoke meant cold and darkness. Warmth meant survival. Comfort was defined differently than today. Animals also lived closer to human life than modern imagination usually pictures. Chickens might remain inside certain buildings overnight, and animals in nearby spaces could be heard breathing or shifting in straw. Their sounds blended into the rhythm of sleep. Silence was not expected. Instead, a living environment surrounded rest. Morning then arrived not by alarm clocks but by gradual light. Dawn spread slowly across the sky, and activity resumed with it. Work began early because daylight was precious. People adjusted naturally to seasonal change. In winter, longer nights created more rest and indoor activity. In summer, daylight extended labor hours. Time was measured by sun position rather than precise minutes. As we sit quietly within this imagined town, the medieval world feels less dramatic and more intimate. The hidden truth is that most of life was neither heroic nor tragic. It was careful, attentive, and shared closely with others. The Middle Ages were not lived at the speed of modern schedules, but at the pace of light, weather, and human presence. So we remain here a moment longer, listening to faint wind against wooden walls and the steady crackle of a small fire, noticing how the past was shaped not only by great events, but by countless unnoticed routines that quietly defined everyday existence. As the first gray light of morning slowly spreads across the rooftops, another hidden part of medieval life begins. The cold. Not the dramatic winter storms we often imagine, but the everyday, constant chill that shaped nearly every activity. Most homes were not truly warm. The hearth provided heat only to the space closest to it, and even then, warmth faded quickly a few steps away. Bedrooms, hallways, and upper floors remained cool for most of the year. People did not expect a comfortable temperature. Instead, they learned to live with it. Getting out of bed was therefore not a simple routine. Blankets were heavy and often shared. Families sometimes slept in the same space, partly for warmth. Rising in the morning meant leaving the only warm place in the house. For a moment, many people simply sat at the edge of the bed, gathering courage before placing their feet onto a cold floor. Clothing was kept close during the night, so it would not feel frozen at dawn. Dressing slowly beside the fire became one of the first daily activities. Water added another quiet challenge. There was no instant access to warm washing. Water had to be carried, often from a shared well or pump, and during colder months it felt sharply cold against the skin. Washing therefore became brief and practical rather than leisurely. Cleanliness mattered, but it was approached realistically. Hands and face were washed most often, while full bathing happened less frequently and required preparation. The idea that medieval people ignored cleanliness is not quite true. Rather, they worked within the limits of their environment, Breakfast itself was simple and steady rather than exciting. Many people ate bread from the previous day because baking occurred in larger batches. Fresh bread every morning was rare outside wealthier households. Bread was softened with broth, ale, or warm liquid so it could be eaten comfortably. This was not seen as poor food, but reliable food. Reliability mattered more than variety. Hunger was a real concern, and predictable nourishment created peace of mind. Work began almost immediately after eating. What often goes unspoken is how physical nearly every task was. There were few purely mental jobs in the modern sense. Even trades that required skill also required strength and repetition. Grinding grain, carrying water, chopping wood, tending animals, repairing tools. These actions filled the day not occasionally, but continuously. Fatigue was normal, and rest periods were short. Yet people did not constantly complain, because such effort was expected from childhood. Children learned early by observation. There was rarely a clear dividing line between childhood and adulthood responsibilities. A young person might start by helping with small tasks, gathering kindling, watching animals, or assisting in preparation of meals. Over years, skills increased naturally. Education was practical. Knowledge passed directly from person to person rather than through formal lessons for most families. Another rarely discussed reality was the shared nature of space. Personal privacy was extremely limited. Rooms were used for multiple purposes, and people were almost always within hearing distance of someone else. Conversations were often low in volume because others were nearby. Emotional life therefore developed differently. Individuals learned to manage feelings quietly and communicate carefully, since loud expression affected everyone in close quarters. Midday did not bring a dramatic break but a pause. Work slowed briefly while people ate again, often outdoors or near a doorway where light entered. Meals were opportunities for conversation, exchanging local news, and maintaining social ties. News traveled through speech, not printed pages. A traveler's story might be discussed for days, and small events became shared memory. Weather played a constant role in decision-making. Rain changed routes, wind affected travel, and daylight determined how long work could continue. Plans were flexible because nature held authority over schedule. People paid close attention to the sky, noticing small signs that indicated change. Observation replaced prediction. Even emotions were shaped by environment. Gratitude for small comforts, a dry day, a successful task, a warm meal, appeared often in daily speech. Life contained difficulty, but expectations were modest. Contentment came from stability rather than abundance. As the day continues, smoke rises from chimneys and distant sounds of tools carry through the air. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything important does. Food prepared, tools repaired, relationships maintained, knowledge passed quietly between generations. These moments rarely entered chronicles or royal records, yet they formed the true experience of medieval life. We remain within this steady rhythm, watching the town fully awaken, understanding that history is not only made of great events, but of ordinary mornings, repeated thousands of times, shaping the thoughts and habits of people who lived long before us. By the time the sun rises higher and shadows shorten along the narrow streets, another overlooked part of medieval life quietly becomes clear: the constant presence of smell. Modern descriptions of the Middle Ages often exaggerate filth, But what is rarely explained is how normal everyday scents were to people living then. The town was not experienced primarily through sight, but through a mixture of familiar odors that signaled safety, work, and daily activity. The first smell most people noticed each morning was smoke. Almost every home maintained a fire for cooking and warmth, and the smoke from dozens of hearths drifted slowly through the town. It did not vanish quickly. Instead, it settled into clothing, wood beams, hair, and fabric. A person walking through the streets could recognize homes simply by scent. Smoke meant food was being prepared and people were awake. To medieval residents, it was reassuring rather than unpleasant. Food preparation added its own steady presence. Bread baking in communal ovens, simmering broth, herbs hanging to dry, and grain being milled all created layers of smell that changed throughout the day. These were not occasional events, but repeating patterns. People could often tell the time by what they smelled: morning baking, midday cooking, evening fires being strengthened again. Animals lived close to human activity as well. Horses, chickens, and livestock were not distant from daily life. Their sounds and scents blended into the environment so completely that they faded into the background of awareness. A traveler entering a town might notice them immediately, but residents rarely thought about them consciously. Familiarity reshaped perception. Another unnoticed reality was how people navigated space using memory rather than signs. There were few written markers in most places, and many individuals could not read even if signs existed. Instead, directions depended on landmarks: a certain tree, a bend in the path, a well, or a recognizable doorway. People developed strong mental maps of their surroundings. Walking at night required remembering distances and counting steps between familiar points. The town lived as much inside the mind as outside it. Inside homes, light remained limited even during the day. Windows were small and often covered, so interiors stayed dim. Eyes adjusted to lower brightness, and people became skilled at working with minimal illumination. Tasks were arranged near doorways or windows whenever possible. Fine detail work happened in the brightest available spot, and as daylight faded, activities gradually shifted to simpler ones. The pace of life followed the sun without needing clocks. Conversation also followed a rhythm shaped by labor. While hands worked, voices spoke quietly. Stories were not delivered as formal speeches but as ongoing conversations woven into tasks. Someone repairing a tool might recount an event from years earlier. A person preparing food might repeat advice once given by a parent. Knowledge spread naturally, carried by repetition rather than written record. What rarely appears in grand history is the patience this created. Many processes required waiting for bread to bake, for water to heat, for tools to be repaired, for daylight to return after storms. Impatience had little purpose because events could not be rushed. Over time, this encouraged careful attention. People noticed details, changes in weather, small improvements in skill, and gradual progress in tasks. Afternoon light eventually softened and the town slowed slightly again. Not because work ended, but because energy was managed. There was an understanding that tasks left unfinished could continue tomorrow. Survival depended on consistency, not speed. This outlook reduced constant urgency. Life moved forward steadily, shaped by repetition more than deadlines. As we continue to sit quietly within this medieval day, the realization grows clearer. Much of what defined the era was not dramatic struggle but adaptation. People adjusted to environment, to limited light, to shared spaces, and to gradual change. Their world was smaller in distance yet deeper in attention. Everyday experiences, the smell of smoke, the sound of animals shifting, the glow of fading sunlight, created a sense of belonging within their surroundings. And so the afternoon settles gently across the town, carrying with it the quiet continuation of ordinary life, reminding us that the past was built less from extraordinary moments and more from countless familiar hours lived patiently within a shared world. As the afternoon moves slowly toward evening, another hidden truth of medieval life begins to appear: the way people experienced time itself. Today we measure time in exact minutes, alarms, and schedules. But in the Middle Ages, time felt softer, almost fluid. There were no personal clocks for most people. Instead, life followed natural signals that everyone quietly understood. The position of the sun mattered more than any number. When shadows grew shorter, people knew midday had arrived. When they stretched long again across the ground, evening approached. Church bells helped organize the community as well. They rang at certain intervals not to rush people but to gently guide activity. The bells were less like commands and more like reminders that the day was moving forward. Hearing them across fields or streets connected individuals to the shared rhythm of the town. Because of this, daily life contained less urgency than we might imagine. Work was steady but rarely frantic. Tasks were completed carefully because mistakes wasted precious materials. A broken tool or damaged clothing could not be easily replaced. Repair was a constant activity. Mending garments, sharpening blades, fixing wooden handles, and patching containers filled quiet moments. Objects were not temporary. They were companions used repeatedly over many years. Another overlooked part of medieval living was waiting. Waiting occurred everywhere. Waiting for crops to grow, for weather to clear, for bread to rise, for travelers to arrive with news. People accepted waiting as natural rather than frustrating. It shaped patience. Conversations often happened during these pauses, and relationships strengthened because time together was not always scheduled, but simply available. Afternoons also brought visitors. Without fast communication, news traveled person to person. A passerby, a merchant, or a neighbor stopping briefly at a doorway became important sources of information. A short conversation could carry stories from distant places, and those stories would be repeated later inside homes. Memory replaced written communication, and listening carefully mattered. People learned to recall details accurately because spoken information guided decisions. The body itself followed the rhythm of daylight. Fatigue appeared naturally as light softened. There was no artificial brightness to extend activity late into the night. Instead, work gradually slowed. Tools were set aside, animals checked, and small preparations for evening began. This transition was gentle rather than sudden. The day did not end abruptly. It faded. Inside homes, preparations for night were thoughtful. Firewood was arranged, candles or lamps prepared sparingly, and simple meals readied. Eating near sunset became routine because eating too late meant using valuable light sources. Families gathered closely, not as a special occasion but as part of everyday order. Conversation during this time carried importance. since it might be the longest period everyone was together without distraction. Another rarely discussed experience was how darkness influenced thought. With fewer visual distractions, people became reflective. Sitting near a fire naturally encouraged storytelling, remembering, and planning. Children listened to repeated tales that shaped their understanding of family and community. These stories were not performances but memory shared aloud. Even emotions were handled differently. Because neighbors lived near and walls were thin, loud conflict affected many people. Calm discussion was often preferred simply to preserve peace within the shared environment. Cooperation extended beyond family into the surrounding homes. Everyone depended on stability. As the last light drains from the sky, the town becomes quieter again. The same streets that carried footsteps all day now soften into shadow. Evening does not feel like an ending, but like a return. A slow drawing inward after hours spent outward. The medieval day closes not with urgency but with gradual stillness. We remain a moment longer beside a dim hearth, watching shadows flicker along wooden walls, recognizing that time in this world was not counted but experienced, moving with sun and season, teaching patience through repetition, and calm acceptance of each passing hour. Now evening has truly settled, and inside the homes of the town another quiet reality of medieval life appears. The importance of shared indoor space. Houses were not designed for personal rooms the way we think of them today. Instead, most daily living happened in one main area where nearly everything took place. Cooking, repairing tools, eating, resting, and conversation all occurred within the same interior environment. The home was less a collection of separate areas and more a single living world. Because of this, people were rarely alone. Even silence was shared. Someone might be sewing near the fire while another prepared food, and another sat resting after the day's work. Conversation moved slowly, sometimes stopping for long stretches without discomfort. Companionship did not require constant speaking. Simply being near familiar people brought comfort at the end of physical labor. Lighting revealed another forgotten part of life. Candles were used carefully because they required resources to produce. A flame was not left burning unnecessarily. As a result, activities after sunset were chosen wisely. Detailed tasks were finished earlier in the day, while evening was reserved for simpler actions, repairing clothing, sorting tools, or preparing for the next morning. The dim glow of a single flame or hearth did not illuminate the whole room. Corners remained shadowed and eyes adjusted gradually. Darkness was not avoided but accepted as part of daily rhythm. People also prepared for the night differently than we do. Before sleep, the house was arranged for morning. Tools were placed where they could be found easily at dawn. Water was set aside, clothing positioned nearby, and the fire reduced but not completely extinguished so it could be revived quickly. Morning efficiency mattered because daylight hours were valuable. Another quiet aspect of medieval evenings was storytelling. These were not dramatic performances but familiar repeated narratives. Elders recounted events they had witnessed, journeys taken years before, or lessons learned from experience. Children heard the same stories many times, gradually memorizing them. Memory served as a form of education. Through repetition, people preserved practical knowledge and family identity. Night also carried a sense of awareness. Even inside, people remained attentive to outside sounds, a change in wind, distant movement, or an animal stirring nearby. Without modern barriers between indoors and outdoors, the boundary felt thin. The world beyond the walls never completely disappeared. This awareness influenced sleep. Many rested lightly, ready to wake if needed. When at last people lay down to sleep, rest did not always mean silence. Breathing, shifting straw bedding, and faint outdoor sounds blended together. The environment felt alive even in darkness, yet familiarity made it calming. What might seem disruptive to us felt normal to them because it happened every night. In this gentle closing of the day, we see a life shaped by closeness. Closeness to family, to environment, and to routine. Privacy was limited, comfort was simple, and expectations were modest. But stability came from repetition. Each evening followed a similar pattern, and that predictability created reassurance. So we sit quietly beside the fading fire, the last embers glowing softly, as the town sleeps once more under a dark sky, reminding us that medieval nights were not empty hours, but living parts of the day, filled with quiet activity, memory, and steady companionship. As the night stretches deeper and the fire sinks into glowing embers, there is another quiet reality of medieval life that rarely appears in history books: the constant presence of vulnerability. Not dramatic danger, not constant chaos, but a steady understanding that life was fragile in ways we no longer experience. This awareness shaped behavior, relationships, and even daily thought. Illness, for example, was not an unusual interruption. It was an expected part of existence. Coughs lingered through winters. Minor injuries could take weeks to heal. A simple infection might become serious without warning. Because of this, people paid close attention to small changes in the body. A slight fever, an unusual fatigue, or a change in appetite did not go unnoticed. Families observed one another carefully, often without speaking about it openly. Care was direct and personal. Herbs were prepared, warm cloths applied, and rest encouraged near the fire. Medicine was not distant or clinical. It was domestic and immediate. What is rarely discussed is how acceptance worked alongside fear. People understood that outcomes were uncertain. This did not make them constantly anxious, but it did create a mindset of preparation. Tools were maintained carefully because replacing them was difficult. Food was stored thoughtfully because scarcity could arrive without warning. Clothing was repaired repeatedly because new fabric required significant effort to produce. Nothing was disposable. Everything had value. Another overlooked reality was the physical closeness of aging and death within daily life. Elders did not live separated from younger generations. They shared the same rooms, the same meals, the same rhythms. Children witnessed aging gradually rather than abstractly. Knowledge of life's limits was not hidden from view. This created a kind of grounded perspective. People celebrated harvests and small successes deeply because they understood how easily circumstances could shift. Even the weather carried weight. A sudden storm could damage crops. A long dry period could reduce yields. Communities watched the sky with attention not as a hobby, but as survival. Conversations often returned to weather patterns, comparing one season to another. Memory of past years guided decisions about planting and storage. Time was not measured only in days but in cycles, harvest to harvest, winter to spring. Daily labor also shaped the body visibly. Hands grew rough. Shoulders strengthened from carrying weight. Backs felt the strain of bending and lifting. These were not signs of hardship in the dramatic sense, but normal marks of life. A person's work could often be recognized simply by observing posture and movement. The body carried history quietly. Another subtle aspect of medieval existence was the importance of cooperation. Survival rarely happened alone. Neighbors relied on one another for assistance with larger tasks like repairing roofs, harvesting fields, or managing livestock. This interdependence built social bonds that were practical rather than sentimental. Helping others was not an optional kindness. It was part of maintaining stability for everyone. Inside the home, small rituals reinforced security. Before sleep, doors were secured carefully, windows were checked, animals were settled. These repeated actions created a sense of readiness, not fear, but awareness. The world beyond the walls was vast and sometimes unpredictable, yet preparation reduced uncertainty. As the fire dims further and night deepens, we sense how medieval life balanced simplicity with seriousness. There was laughter, storytelling, and companionship, but beneath it all lay a steady understanding of fragility. This understanding did not paralyze people. Instead, it encouraged attentiveness to family, to tools, to food, to weather, and to time itself. So we remain here, listening to the quiet breathing of a household at rest, recognizing that what nobody talks about is not dramatic suffering, but this continuous state of careful living, a life shaped by preparation, awareness, and the quiet strength required to meet each new day without guarantee of what it might bring. Somewhere in the middle of the night, long after the fire has settled into a faint red glow and most of the town rests, a small movement often begins again inside many medieval homes. This was another detail rarely described in grand history. People did not always remain asleep until morning. After several hours of rest, it was completely normal for individuals to wake quietly, not startled, not worried, but calm and alert for a short time. The house would still be dark, yet not completely silent. A log might shift in the hearth, straw bedding might rustle, and someone would sit up slowly, allowing their eyes to adjust. There was no urgency to fall back asleep immediately. Instead, this waking period became a peaceful pause in the middle of the night. A person might add a small piece of wood to the embers, step briefly outside to feel the air, whisper a few words to another awake family member, or simply sit and think. In this quiet interval, thoughts felt different from daytime thoughts. Without work to perform and without daylight distractions, reflection came naturally. People considered plans for tomorrow, remembered conversations from earlier, or mentally arranged tasks they would complete once dawn arrived. This was not a scheduled habit, yet it happened often enough to be ordinary. Afterwards, sleep returned gradually, and the remaining hours of night passed more deeply. The outdoor world at that time felt vast. When someone stepped outside, the sky appeared wide and filled with stars unhidden by artificial light. The darkness was not empty, but layered. Distant animal sounds, soft wind across rooftops, and faint movements carried across long distances. A person walking carefully along a familiar path might recognize each step by memory rather than sight. Awareness sharpened. Every sound held meaning. Back inside, warmth near the hearth slowly rebuilt comfort. The second sleep after this waking period often felt heavier and more restorative. By the time the first faint light approached the horizon, the household would again be resting deeply. Another unnoticed part of medieval nights was the emotional calm this rhythm created. Dividing sleep into two parts reduced anxiety about waking during darkness. People did not interpret nighttime waking as a problem. It was simply part of living. Because they expected it, they experienced less worry. The mind accepted the night as a cycle rather than a single block of rest. Dawn then approached gradually. At first, only a slight change in the color of the sky appeared through small windows. Birds began before people fully stirred, their sounds marking the coming day earlier than any bell. Someone in the house would rise first, often the person responsible for rekindling the fire. Carefully, they coaxed the embers back into flame using prepared kindling left ready from the night before. Warmth returned slowly, and with it, the household awakened. No alarm sounded. Instead, movement spread gently. One person sat up, another shifted, and quiet conversation began again. Morning did not burst into existence. It unfolded. The day resumed exactly where yesterday had left it, continuing the steady chain of ordinary living. What nobody often mentions about medieval life is how predictable this rhythm felt. The same sequence repeated: dusk, sleep, waking, sleep again, dawn, forming a pattern the body trusted. In a world filled with uncertainty, the reliability of night and morning created reassurance. So as early light touches the edges of the sky and smoke soon rises again from chimneys, we understand that medieval nights were not empty gaps between days. They were structured experiences, containing reflection, stillness, and gradual renewal, quietly preparing people to begin another day shaped by routine and familiarity. When full daylight finally spreads across the town again, another unnoticed part of medieval life begins: the sharing of news. Today, information travels instantly, but in the Middle Ages, news moved at the pace of footsteps, hooves, and memory. People did not wake and check messages or written reports. Instead, knowledge arrived through voices, carried carefully from one person to another. A traveler entering the town was therefore important long before anyone knew exactly why. Someone coming from another village, a passing merchant, or a messenger on a road brought more than goods. They brought stories. Villagers gathered naturally near wells, doorways, or work areas to listen. The conversation was patient. The traveler spoke slowly, recalling events from days or even weeks earlier. Every detail mattered: road conditions, harvest results in nearby areas, rumors of distant conflict, or even simple observations about weather patterns. Because memory was the main form of communication, people listened closely. Interrupting too often risked losing important information. A story might then be repeated many times throughout the day, each listener becoming the next speaker. By evening, nearly everyone in the town could know what had been said, not through written record but through careful repetition. In this way, spoken words carried authority. Inside homes, the news was discussed again, often around the midday meal or evening fire. Families considered what it meant for them. A mention of poor crops elsewhere might encourage more careful storage. A safe road report might allow travel plans. Even small details influenced decision-making. Information shaped behavior because life depended on preparation. Another overlooked aspect was how slowly changes reached people. Trends, ideas, and customs traveled gradually. A tool design seen in another village might appear months later. A new method of planting might be discussed for years before being adopted. This slow spread created stability. Sudden shifts were rare, and communities adjusted gently over time rather than abruptly. Midday gatherings also served social purposes beyond news. People strengthened relationships through conversation. Greeting neighbors daily built familiarity and trust. Knowing others well mattered because cooperation was essential. Shared labor, borrowing tools, or helping during illness depended on strong connections. Even disagreements followed a communal rhythm. Conflicts rarely stayed private for long because space was shared and interactions frequent. Resolution often came through calm discussion involving several voices. Restoring harmony mattered more than proving one person correct. The goal was continued coexistence rather than victory. Another detail rarely mentioned is how carefully people observed one another's mood and behavior. In a small community, changes were noticed quickly. If someone seemed unusually quiet or troubled, others paid attention. Concern appeared in simple ways: an extra visit, an offered task, or quiet companionship. Social awareness functioned as support long before formal systems existed. As afternoon light brightens the streets, daily tasks continue, but conversation never fully stops. Work and speech blend together. Hands remain busy while voices exchange memories, advice, and observations. The town lives not only through labor, but through communication, a steady flow of human presence connecting individuals into a shared understanding. By now we begin to see that medieval life depended on awareness more than speed. People watched, listened, and remembered carefully because information was valuable. The spoken word carried weight, and trust grew from reliable sharing. So we stand quietly in the middle of this living town, hearing distant voices drift along narrow paths and recognizing that history was not only built by rulers and battles, but also by countless conversations, repeated patiently from morning to evening, shaping how communities thought and acted together. As the afternoon light begins to soften and shadows slowly lengthen across the packed earth streets, another overlooked reality of medieval life quietly reveals itself: how people experienced silence. Not complete silence, but a softer world without the constant background noise we live with today. There were no engines, no electrical hums, no distant highways, and no machines running endlessly. Sound appeared only when something living produced it, and when activity paused, the environment grew calm in a way difficult to imagine now. In the fields beyond the town walls, a person could hear wind passing through crops from far away, before it even reached them. Footsteps were recognizable. Each individual walked slightly differently, and neighbors often knew who approached simply by listening. The creak of a cartwheel could be identified at a distance, and the slow rhythm of hooves on a road announced a traveler long before they appeared in sight. Sound carried information as clearly as vision. Inside the town, quiet moments appeared throughout the day. During midday heat, activity slowed naturally. People worked, but speech decreased. Energy was conserved. Without constant distraction, thought became clearer. Many tasks, mending clothing, shaping wood, preparing tools, required attention rather than speed. Silence was not awkward. It was useful. Concentration depended on it. This environment shaped memory. Because fewer competing sounds existed, people noticed small details more easily. The location of an object, the position of a tool, or a change in the weather was remembered accurately. Observation replaced written reminders. Daily awareness became a skill practiced without realizing it. Even emotional life was influenced by this quieter setting. People had more time inside their own thoughts, walking along a path, tending animals, or performing repetitive work created long stretches where the mind wandered freely. Reflection came naturally. Individuals considered past conversations, future plans, and personal decisions, while their hands continued familiar motions. Thinking was woven into action. Late afternoon also marked another routine often ignored. Preparation for the next day began before the current one ended. Tools were cleaned while still in hand. Materials were arranged for morning use. Tasks were not abandoned suddenly at sunset, but gradually completed and organized. This reduced confusion at dawn and preserved valuable daylight. The next morning had already begun, in a sense, before night arrived. Another rarely discussed detail was how much people relied on natural light for emotional comfort. Bright days lifted mood noticeably. Overcast weather quieted conversation and slowed pace. People recognized this change, but did not describe it in modern psychological terms. Instead, they simply adjusted behavior, working indoors, speaking more softly, or choosing calmer tasks. As evening approached, distant sounds changed again. Animals returned, footsteps moved toward homes, and the rhythm of daily labor faded. A certain expectation settled over the town. Not relief exactly, but completion. The day had been used. Effort had been given. Nothing urgent remained. What becomes clear is that medieval people lived within an environment that constantly informed them. Sound, light, and movement guided behavior without needing written schedules. Awareness replaced instruction. The body learned the day's pattern naturally, and so we pause here at the edge of evening, listening to a world slowly becoming quieter, understanding that what nobody often mentions about the Middle Ages is not only hardship, but this deeply attentive way of living, a life where observation mattered as much as action, and where silence itself carried meaning. As the sun sinks lower, and a golden light stretches across rooftops and fields, another hidden layer of medieval life quietly unfolds. The way people related to authority in their daily routines. History books often describe kings, nobles, and laws in dramatic terms. Yet what is rarely explored is how ordinary people experience power not as distant spectacle, but as something woven gently into everyday life. Most villagers rarely saw their lord or regional ruler directly. Authority existed through symbols and small obligations rather than constant presence. A portion of harvested grain set aside, a shared Labor Day repairing roads, or attendance at certain gatherings reminded people of structure without dramatic confrontation. These acts were not necessarily resented every day. They were accepted as part of the order that kept the wider world stable. Life depended on predictability, and predictable authority provided that framework. In towns, guilds shaped another form of quiet control. Craftsmen belonged to structured groups that regulated training, quality, and trade. A young apprentice did not simply decide to practice a craft. Years of observation and supervised labor preceded independence. This system slowed ambition but strengthened skill. Reputation mattered deeply, and producing careful work preserved both livelihood and honor. Religion also touched daily life in subtle ways beyond ceremony. Church bells not only marked time but reminded people of shared belief. Rituals framed the year, feast days, fasting periods, seasonal observances, giving structure to time itself. These were not always dramatic events, but familiar markers that shaped routine. Faith offered explanation for uncertainty, especially when illness or hardship arrived without warning. Another often overlooked detail was how disputes were managed. Without modern legal systems accessible to everyone, conflicts were frequently resolved through conversation guided by respected figures in the community. Elders or trusted neighbors helped settle disagreements. Restoring balance mattered more than punishing harshly. Stability protected everyone's survival. Even taxes and dues, though sometimes heavy, were experienced practically. People understood obligations as part of existing within a larger system. The frustration came not from the concept of duty, but from unpredictability. When demands changed suddenly or felt unfair, anxiety grew. But when expectations remained steady, life adjusted around them. As evening shadows lengthen further, individuals complete the final tasks of the day under this quiet framework of order. They do not speak constantly about kings or laws. Instead, authority remains in the background, shaping routine through expectation rather than direct interaction. What nobody often describes is how normal this felt. Structure was not debated daily. It was absorbed into habit. Just as the sun rose and set reliably, so did obligations. People moved within a system that seemed as natural as weather, rarely imagining alternatives. The last light now fades gently, and the town prepares once more for night. Doors close, fires glow, and familiar rhythms resume. Within this steady pattern of obligation, labor, conversation, and rest, medieval life continues, not as endless drama, but as quiet adaptation to a world where authority, environment, and community blended into one continuous experience. As evening settles again and the last work of the day fades into slower movement, another rarely described part of medieval life becomes visible: the way people experienced personal identity. Today, individuals often think of themselves as separate from their surroundings. But in the Middle Ages, identity was closely tied to place, family, and occupation. A person was not simply themselves. They were someone's child, a member of a certain household, and part of a specific community known by others for generations. Names themselves reflected this connection. Many individuals were identified by their father's name, their village, or their craft. A person might be known not just as a single individual, but as the miller's son, or the woman from the riverside house. This was not considered limiting. It provided recognition and belonging. Reputation traveled through these associations, and behavior reflected not only on the individual, but on the entire family. Because of this, actions were chosen carefully. Kindness, reliability, and cooperation strengthened how others viewed a household. One person's behavior could affect opportunities for relatives. Trust formed slowly but lasted a long time once established. Communities remembered. Stories about people were repeated across years, shaping expectations for future generations. Children grew into this awareness gradually. From a young age, they observed adults interacting with neighbors, sharing resources, and helping during difficulty. Responsibility was learned through participation rather than formal instruction. A child helping carry water or gather wood was not only completing a task, but learning their place within the network of daily life. Another subtle reality was how limited movement often was. Many individuals lived most of their lives within a small geographic area. Travel existed, but for ordinary people it was uncommon. This did not necessarily feel restrictive. Familiar surroundings offered security. Paths, fields, and buildings became part of memory, and knowing every detail of the local environment created confidence. People understood the seasons, the soil, and the habits of neighbors intimately. Even celebrations reflected shared identity. Gatherings were less about spectacle and more about participation. Singing, simple games, and communal meals strengthened connections. The enjoyment came not from novelty, but from familiarity. Seeing known faces and repeating traditions carried across years. Work also reinforced identity. A craft was not merely employment, but part of how a person understood themselves. Skills learned over long practice created pride. Producing a well-made tool, garment, or product brought satisfaction beyond income. The object carried the maker's reputation into the hands of others. As night grows deeper and voices soften inside homes, we sense how strongly belonging shaped emotion. Loneliness was experienced differently because individuals were rarely detached from community life. Even solitude occurred within awareness of nearby presence. The medieval world therefore felt smaller in distance but fuller in connection. People lived among others who knew them well, and this familiarity guided behavior gently. The quiet interactions of daily life, shared tasks, repeated greetings, remembered stories, built identity slowly over time. And so we remain in the dim light of another evening, recognizing that what nobody often talks about is how deeply people were rooted in their surroundings, living not as isolated individuals, but as threads woven continuously into the fabric of their community. As the night settles fully and most houses fall quiet again, there is another aspect of medieval life that rarely appears in dramatic histories. The experience of fear, not loud or constant, but gentle and persistent, woven into the background of everyday thinking. Medieval people were not living in terror, yet they lived with awareness that much of the world was unknown to them. Darkness beyond the last house, deep forests outside farmland, and distant roads carried uncertainty because they could not be easily observed or explained. After sunset, the town felt smaller. During daylight, the same roads were ordinary paths, but at night they seemed longer. Landmarks disappeared into shadow, and familiar places became shapes rather than clear objects. A person stepping beyond the last lit doorway did so carefully, not because danger always waited, but because vision was limited. Human sight depended entirely on moonlight or memory. Walking required concentration, and people often carried small lanterns only when necessary, protecting the flame from wind. Stories filled this gap in knowledge. Tales of wandering spirits, unusual lights, and strange sounds were shared not always as literal belief, but as explanation for what could not be understood easily. If someone heard movement in distant darkness, or saw mist rising in moonlight, imagination completed the picture. These stories also served practical purposes. They warned children not to wander far at night, and reminded travelers to stay on known roads. Caution became tradition, yet alongside fear existed familiarity. The same people who spoke of strange possibilities also understood their environment intimately. They recognized animal calls, knew seasonal changes in sound, and could distinguish ordinary night noises from unusual ones. A dog barking differently or animals stirring suddenly signaled that something had changed nearby. Attention to these small signs provided reassurance. Knowledge reduced uncertainty. Inside homes, protective habits developed naturally. Doors were secured, tools placed nearby, and embers managed carefully to prevent fire spreading. Fire itself represented both comfort and danger. It warmed the house and cooked food, yet if left unattended, it could damage the entire structure. Evening routines included checking the hearth and ensuring sparks were contained. Responsibility extended even into rest. Another overlooked reality was the mental quiet created by limited information. People did not receive constant news from distant places. Most concerns centered on immediate surroundings: weather, health, harvest, and neighbors. This narrower focus reduced overwhelming worry. While hardships existed, they were specific rather than endless. Attention stayed grounded in present tasks. Night, therefore, became a time of stillness rather than activity. Without bright light or constant communication, minds slowed. After conversation ended, individuals lay in darkness listening to familiar sounds: wind against walls, animals shifting, the faint crackle of cooling wood. Gradually, breathing deepened and sleep returned. What nobody often describes is how this pattern shaped emotional life. The alternation between shared daytime effort and quiet nighttime reflection created balance. Work demanded physical strength. Night allowed mental rest. The day connected people outwardly, and the night brought them inward again. So we remain in this calm darkness a moment longer. The town resting under a sky filled with stars, understanding that medieval nights were not only about hardship or superstition, but about awareness, a careful attention to surroundings, to safety, and to the quiet rhythm that guided each person gently from one day into the next. As another dawn slowly approaches and faint light begins to soften the horizon, a different unnoticed truth of medieval life becomes clear. People were almost never completely idle, yet they were also rarely hurried. Their days were full, but the fullness came from repetition rather than pressure. Tasks returned again and again in gentle cycles, and because of this, much of life was built on habit. Morning routines did not require decisions. A person woke and already knew the sequence: revive the fire, prepare simple food, check animals, gather water, and begin the same form of work practiced yesterday. This repetition was not dull to them. It created stability. In a world where larger events could not be controlled, familiar actions gave reassurance. Knowing what to do each morning removed uncertainty. Tools themselves encouraged this rhythm. Many were handmade and unique. A tool shaped by its owner fit their hand perfectly, and over years the body learned its weight and movement. Using it became almost automatic. The mind could wander while hands continued working. This allowed people to think while laboring, reflecting quietly as their tasks progressed. Thought and work were not separate activities. They happened together. Another rarely discussed experience was the deep awareness of seasons. Today, seasons can feel symbolic, but in the medieval world they guided survival. Winter meant conserving, repairing, and waiting. Spring meant preparation and planting. Summer meant long labor hours, and autumn meant gathering and storing. People sensed time passing not by calendars but by temperature, daylight, and the behavior of animals. Each season carried expectations learned over generations. Because of this, patience was practical rather than philosophical. Crops could not be rushed. Animals matured slowly. Materials dried at their own pace. People learned to observe progress gradually instead of demanding immediate results. This shaped temperament. Quick frustration offered no benefit when nature itself set the schedule. Community also reinforced repetition. Neighbors often performed similar tasks at similar times, and shared rhythms emerged. Smoke rising together from several homes, sounds of work beginning at once, and evening quiet settling across the town created a collective pattern. Individuals moved within this pattern almost instinctively. Even rest followed habit. When daylight faded, the body naturally slowed. There was no decision about staying awake late because little could be done in darkness without wasting resources. Fatigue aligned with nightfall. Sleep arrived not as a forced action, but as a natural conclusion to activity. Another subtle detail was how memory was trained by routine. Because tasks repeated daily, small changes became noticeable. A tool out of place, an animal behaving differently, or a shift in weather was recognized immediately. Awareness sharpened through familiarity. Attention became part of survival. As the first morning sounds return and birds begin again, the town prepares for another day identical in many ways to the last, yet still meaningful. What nobody often mentions about medieval life is this steady continuity. Not dramatic progress, but reliable repetition that built security over time. We watch the sky brighten slowly and understand that medieval existence was shaped less by sudden events and more by cycles quietly repeating, giving people a sense of order that allowed them to move forward calmly within a changing world. As the morning fully opens and sunlight spreads across rooftops and narrow lanes, another quiet truth of medieval life becomes visible. How people understood health long before modern medicine explained the body. They did not think in terms of bacteria or vitamins, yet they constantly watched small changes in how a person looked, moved, and behaved. Health was observed rather than measured. Neighbors noticed when someone walked slower than usual, when a voice sounded weaker, or when a person stopped appearing outdoors at familiar times. These signs mattered because communities depended on each member's ability to work. Illness was not private in the way it often is today. It became a shared concern, discussed calmly rather than dramatically. Care began with simple adjustments. Workload shifted quietly so the ill person could rest. Meals were brought to their door. Someone else handled necessary tasks for a short time. This support was practical, not ceremonial. Helping a neighbor recover also protected the stability of the whole community. Cooperation increased survival. Treatments reflected observation passed across generations. Warmth was given when a body felt chilled. Cool air and water were offered when fever rose. Herbs were used not because of scientific theory, but because experience suggested relief. If a plant soothed discomfort once, it was remembered and used again. Knowledge was built slowly through memory. Rest itself was considered important. Without constant schedules forcing activity, a sick person could remain still for long periods. The body healed at its own pace. People did not always expect instant recovery. Waiting was accepted. Patience extended even into illness. Another overlooked detail was how strongly mood influenced perceived health. Comfort from family and familiar surroundings mattered. Conversation, reassurance, and presence often calmed anxiety. The emotional and physical were not separated in their understanding. A peaceful mind was thought to help a body regain strength. At the same time, uncertainty remained. Not every illness improved, and when recovery failed, communities faced loss together. Death was understood as part of life's rhythm. not because it caused less sadness, but because it occurred within familiar surroundings among known people. Farewell happened at home, not distant institutions. After recovery, normal routines returned gradually. A person resumed small tasks first, rebuilding strength through daily action. Work itself acted as rehabilitation, moving again, walking familiar paths, and using tools restored both body and confidence. As midday approaches and activity grows again across the village, we see that medieval healthcare was not organized through buildings or systems, but through attention, neighbors watching neighbors, families supporting members, and knowledge carried through memory rather than books. What nobody often talks about is this quiet network of care, informal yet constant, where observation replaced measurement and community replaced institution. Within that shared awareness, people navigated sickness and recovery together, guided by familiarity and patience rather than urgency. By the time midday passes and the sun stands high above the fields, another overlooked feature of medieval life quietly appears: how people understood privacy. In the modern world, privacy often means separation, walls, and personal space. But in a medieval settlement, life was lived very close together. Homes were small, families were large, and most daily activities happened in shared rooms. Yet people still found ways to create moments of personal quiet, not by physical distance but by social understanding. Inside a house, a single main room held cooking, eating, repairing tools, and resting. Several individuals worked at once, each absorbed in their own task. Because this closeness was normal, people learned to give each other a kind of respectful inattention. They heard conversations but did not interrupt. They saw emotions but did not always question them. Privacy existed as agreement rather than architecture. If someone sat silently near the hearth, others allowed silence to remain. If a person stepped briefly outside, no explanation was demanded. Even outdoors, privacy depended on routine. Villagers understood each other's schedules so well that they knew when certain paths would be empty. A person seeking quiet might walk to a familiar place, a riverside, a field boundary, or a tree at the edge of farmland. These spots were not hidden, yet others recognized their purpose and passed without disturbing. Personal space came from shared awareness rather than isolation. Letters were rare for most people, so communication remained face-to-face. Because of this, tone and expression carried importance. A conversation held softly in a corner signaled seriousness, and nearby listeners politely turned attention elsewhere. This behavior was not formally taught. Children learned it by watching adults. Respect was demonstrated by choosing not to overhear. Another quiet form of privacy appeared in emotional life. Grief, worry, or deep thought often showed in posture more than words. When someone seemed troubled, neighbors did not always ask direct questions. Instead, they offered practical help, assisting with work or sharing food, allowing the person space to recover without public explanation. Support and discretion worked together. Clothing also reflected this social understanding. Garments were simple, yet individuals adjusted them carefully when outside. Not because of strict fashion, but because presentation communicated self-respect and respect toward others. Appearance helped maintain dignity within a crowded environment where everyone saw everyone else daily. Night offered the deepest privacy of all. Once the house darkened and conversation slowed, thoughts turned inward. The quiet hours before sleep allowed reflection no one else could hear. In a world with little written record for most individuals, memory became the private space where hopes, regrets, and plans were held. Work, too, carried a personal dimension. Though performed among others, many tasks allowed mental solitude. Repetitive motion, spinning thread, carving wood, sharpening tools, created a rhythm where the mind wandered freely. Even surrounded by community, a person could think privately. What becomes clear is that medieval privacy was not absence of people, but presence of understanding. Individuals lived constantly near one another yet maintained personal dignity through shared customs of patience and restraint. No signs marked these rules, yet everyone followed them because harmony depended on it. As the afternoon begins to soften and activity continues steadily, we recognize a subtle balance: closeness without intrusion, awareness without interference. Medieval life did not separate people physically, but it protected their inner world through mutual respect. In this way, personal space existed quietly inside a crowded society, carried not by walls, but by behavior learned and practiced each day. As the afternoon slowly moves toward evening and the warmth of the day begins to fade, another hidden reality of medieval life quietly reveals itself: how people experienced time itself. Today, time is divided by numbers, alarms, and precise schedules. But in the medieval world, time was felt rather than measured. Most ordinary people did not live by clocks. Instead, they lived by patterns they could see, hear, and sense around them. Morning did not begin at an exact hour. It began when the sky lightened enough to recognize shapes inside the house, and the first birds started calling. A person did not say 6 o'clock. They simply knew it was time to rise because light had returned and the body felt rested. In the same way, work did not start suddenly. It unfolded naturally. The fire was stirred, food prepared, tools gathered, and activity increased gradually. Church bells helped organize larger parts of the day, but even these were not precise minutes. They marked moments: early morning prayer, midday pause, evening quiet. People did not rush anxiously to beat the bell. They adjusted pace gently, finishing what was in their hands and then moving to the next task. Time guided them without pressuring them. This created a different relationship with waiting. Waiting was common and not considered wasted. Bread needed rising, water needed heating, crops needed growth. A traveler might take hours to arrive, and during that period people continued ordinary activity instead of watching constantly. Patience was practical because impatience changed nothing. Seasons extended this sense of time even further. Summer days felt long and active, while winter days were shorter and calmer. People did not attempt to force identical productivity year-round. They adapted. Winter allowed repair, storytelling, and quieter indoor tasks. Summer demanded longer outdoor effort. The year itself became a slow rhythm. Children learned time through observation rather than instruction. They recognized morning from cool air, midday from bright light overhead, and evening from shadows stretching across fields. Knowledge of time belonged to the senses. Even weather contributed: the smell of approaching rain, the heaviness of air before a storm, or the particular stillness before snowfall. Night brought another dimension. Without artificial lighting strong enough to extend work for long hours, darkness signaled closure. People completed what they could and accepted what remained unfinished. Tomorrow would continue the task. This acceptance prevented the constant urgency familiar today. Memory also changed under this system. Instead of recalling exact dates, people remembered events by context. The harvest season, a cold winter, a year of heavy rain. Personal history was tied to nature's pattern. Life was recorded in experiences rather than numbers. As evening settles and the final daylight fades behind the horizon, we understand that medieval people were not careless about time. They were integrated with it. They moved alongside the day, rather than trying to control it. The sun, seasons, and human body together formed a natural schedule that required little explanation. In this slower rhythm, the passing of hours felt steady and continuous. Time did not chase them forward. It carried them gently from one moment to the next, allowing attention to remain on immediate tasks instead of distant deadlines. What nobody often mentions is that medieval life followed a living clock, the world itself. And by listening to it, people shaped their days with calm regularity. As twilight deepens and the last glow fades from the western sky, another subtle part of medieval existence quietly appears: the way people understood learning. When we imagine education today, we picture schools, books, and structured lessons. Yet for most medieval people, learning was continuous and woven into ordinary activity. Knowledge was not gathered in a separate place. It lived inside daily life. Children did not spend their early years separated from adult responsibilities. From the time they could walk steadily, they observed. They watched hands knead dough, mend fabric, guide animals, shape wood, and prepare tools. No formal instruction was announced. Instead, explanation happened naturally while work continued. A parent or older sibling spoke calmly while demonstrating, and the child repeated small parts of the task. Mistakes were expected and corrected gently through repetition. Memory became the main teacher. Because written materials were rare for ordinary households, information was carried in speech. Recipes, techniques, and local knowledge were repeated many times until remembered completely. A child learned not only how to perform a task but when to perform it, which plant was gathered at what season, which weather signaled planting, and which sounds warned of approaching change. This created practical intelligence closely connected to environment. Stories also played a role. Evenings often included quiet storytelling where older members of the household described past events, journeys, and lessons learned through experience. These stories were not only entertainment. They passed warnings, advice, and moral understanding. Through listening, children gained awareness of consequences and responsibilities without formal rules written down. Apprenticeship extended this process further. When a young person showed interest or ability, they joined an experienced craftsperson and spent years learning patiently. Progress was slow. First they watched, then assisted, and only much later performed independently. Skill was valued over speed. A well-made object proved competence more than any certificate. Another overlooked detail was how adults continued learning throughout life. A farmer learned better planting methods through observation of seasons. A builder improved structure by noticing which repairs lasted longest. Knowledge grew through accumulated experience. There was no clear moment when learning ended. Respect for elders came partly from this understanding. Older individuals carried decades of memory about weather patterns, illnesses, and past hardships. Their advice was practical because it came from survival. Listening to them increased safety. As night settles and voices soften indoors, we recognize that medieval education was not absent but different. It was steady, personal, and grounded in observation. Learning came from participation rather than lectures, and knowledge was tied closely to usefulness. Within this quiet exchange of memory and practice, skills moved from one generation to the next, ensuring continuity. What nobody often mentions is that entire communities functioned as classrooms, where every task taught something, and every day added another small lesson to a lifetime of understanding. As the night grows deeper and the village settles into a softer quiet, another rarely described part of medieval life slowly becomes clear: the way people experienced companionship and loneliness. Modern life often allows a person to be physically surrounded yet emotionally distant. But in the medieval world, physical presence itself shaped relationships in powerful ways. People lived, worked, and rested in constant proximity, and this closeness created a particular form of human connection. Most individuals were rarely alone for long stretches. A household contained several generations, and even outside the home, neighbors were always nearby. Daily work brought people together naturally, gathering water, tending animals, preparing food, repairing tools. Conversation did not always need to be deep or long. Sometimes simple shared silence created comfort. Being near others provided reassurance without requiring explanation. Friendship developed slowly through repeated interaction. Seeing the same faces each day built familiarity. Trust formed not from promises but from observation, noticing who helped during difficult moments, who kept agreements, and who behaved steadily over time. Reliability mattered more than charm. A person known for consistency became valued within the community. Marriage, too, was influenced by this environment. Partnerships often grew from practical understanding rather than sudden romance. Couples learned each other's habits through daily routine, cooperating in work and responsibility. Affection appeared quietly. Shared tasks completed smoothly, meals prepared thoughtfully, and small acts of assistance during fatigue. Emotional expression existed but was often understated. Loneliness still occurred, but it appeared differently. Rather than isolation from lack of contact, loneliness often followed absence. When someone traveled, fell ill, or died, the empty space left in routine felt noticeable. A missing voice at a meal or an unused tool hanging in its place reminded others constantly. Memory was tied to habit, and when habit changed, emotion followed. Community gatherings helped soften this feeling. Evening visits, shared meals during certain seasons, and cooperative workdays brought people together regularly. Participation was expected, not forced, and it strengthened belonging. A person who attended felt included. A person who withdrew was gently noticed and often approached with quiet concern. Another subtle detail was how communication relied on attention. Without written messages for most ordinary people, tone, facial expression, and posture carried meaning. A slight pause in greeting or a change in routine could signal worry. Others responded with patience rather than immediate questioning, allowing the individual to speak when ready. As midnight approaches and most lights have faded, the settlement rests not only physically but socially. Each person knows others are nearby, even while sleeping. Safety came partly from this awareness. Presence itself provided comfort. What nobody often describes is that medieval companionship was built from continuity, shared labor, repeated meetings, and steady familiarity. Relationships were maintained through everyday interaction rather than occasional contact. In this environment, belonging was not declared. It was lived quietly through routine. Within the calm darkness, we understand that people carried one another's presence into their thoughts, and even in silence they were connected by the steady rhythm of life moving together through each passing day. As the darkest hours of night slowly pass and the air grows cooler before dawn, another quiet truth of medieval existence comes forward. The way people understood security. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often think of danger everywhere, yet daily life relied less on weapons and more on familiarity and routine. Safety was created through awareness rather than constant defense. A village did not sleep carelessly. Even while resting, small habits continued. Animals were kept close to homes, tools were stored in known places, and doors were secured not with complex locks, but with simple barriers understood by everyone. These measures were not dramatic, they were ordinary. Most people trusted neighbors because they had known them for years, sometimes their entire lives. Recognition itself became protection. A stranger stood out immediately because everyone else was familiar. Travelers approaching a settlement were noticed long before arrival. Sound carried across open land, and movement along a road was visible from a distance. People observed quietly, not with alarm but with attention. Curiosity replaced fear at first. A visitor was greeted, asked simple questions, and offered direction. This exchange served a purpose, understanding intention. Communication created safety more often than confrontation. Inside the community, cooperation strengthened security. During busy seasons, neighbors watched each other's homes naturally while moving between tasks. Children played within sight of adults. If an animal wandered or smoke appeared unexpectedly, someone responded quickly. Responsibility was shared without formal organization. Everyone participated because everyone benefited. Nighttime caution existed, but it was measured. Individuals avoided unnecessary travel in darkness because visibility was limited, not because danger was constant. Paths were remembered carefully. People carried small light sources when needed and moved steadily rather than quickly. Knowing the landscape reduced risk. Another overlooked element was reputation. A person known for honesty gained trust easily, while someone careless with agreements lost it. Because communities were stable and long-lasting, reputation mattered greatly. Social memory encouraged reliable behavior. People acted carefully not from fear of punishment but from desire to remain respected. Even disputes were handled with this same awareness. Arguments occurred, yet open violence within the community was rare because it disrupted survival. Conflict was calmed through discussion guided by respected individuals who valued restoration over escalation. Peace allowed daily work to continue smoothly. As faint light begins to touch the horizon and early birds call again, the settlement prepares to wake. Throughout the night, nothing dramatic has happened, and that itself reflects medieval security. Stability built from familiarity, shared responsibility, and steady observation rather than constant threat. What nobody often mentions is that ordinary safety came not from walls or guards alone, but from relationships. Knowing one another, recognizing patterns, and maintaining routine created protection more effectively than force. In this quiet understanding, people rested with reasonable confidence, ready to begin another day within the same dependable circle of life. As dawn fully arrives and soft light stretches across fields, rooftops, and narrow village paths, we arrive at one final truth about medieval life that rarely receives attention: the quiet resilience that held everything together. Not the loud events written in chronicles, not the battles and coronations, but the steady endurance of ordinary people who woke each morning and continued. History often remembers extremes. It records plagues, wars, and dramatic change. Yet most medieval days were not extreme. They were steady. They were repetitive. They were built from countless small decisions: tending animals, repairing tools, cooking meals, caring for children, honoring agreements, and observing the rhythm of seasons. The true story of the Middle Ages is not only in castles and kings, but in the quiet persistence of households that survived year after year without spectacle. What nobody talks about is how adaptable these communities were. When harvests were smaller than expected, they adjusted portions carefully. When weather shifted unexpectedly, they altered plans without complaint. When illness struck, neighbors stepped in quietly, sharing labor and food. There was no grand announcement of resilience. It was simply practiced. Even entertainment was simple but meaningful. Laughter came from shared stories, not elaborate performance. Music existed in small gatherings, sometimes only a single instrument filling the evening air. These moments did not seek to escape life. They were woven directly into it. Joy appeared in moderation, just like work. Faith, too, offered structure without constant intensity. It shaped calendars and moral understanding, but for most people it functioned as reassurance. Belief provided explanation for hardship and gratitude for survival. Rituals marked transitions: birth, marriage, death, gently reminding communities that life moved in cycles. And perhaps the most overlooked truth is this: medieval people did not think of themselves as living in a dark age. They lived in the present, solving immediate problems, caring for families, and planning for tomorrow's tasks. They did not know they were history. They simply lived. As we step back from this world and let its rhythm settle, we begin to understand that the Middle Ages were not only defined by hardship, but by balance between work and rest, closeness and privacy, caution and trust, patience and action. It was a world that moved slower, but not without intelligence. It was quieter, but not empty. It was structured by nature and community, rather than constant urgency. And now, as this long journey through forgotten corners of medieval life gently comes to a close, let the image remain in your mind. A village waking with the sun, smoke rising from simple homes, tools being lifted once more, conversations beginning softly, life continuing as it always had. If this calm walk through history helped you see the Middle Ages in a new way, then let the journey continue. Like the quiet rhythm of those old days, your support keeps the story moving forward. If you enjoyed this deep, steady exploration, consider liking the video, subscribing for more long-form history, and letting the next chapter unfold just as slowly and thoughtfully. Until next time, we leave the medieval world not with noise but with understanding, and the steady reminder that history was lived by ordinary people, one quiet morning at a time.